Hey guys, tonight we're not in castles or halls of song. We're in Rome, in Nero's palace, where grief turned to obsession and obsession to cruelty. The blade bites cold against your skin. Hands hold you still. Somewhere, incense still lingers for a dead Empress, Nero's wife, gone too soon, and now the Emperor's gaze fixes on you. You are the boy chosen to replace her. Your body is no longer your own. If this kind of slow drift through history feels like the company you want tonight, you're welcome to like or subscribe. No pressure, only if it helps you unwind. And in the comments, share where you're listening from and what time it is there. It's strangely soothing to imagine this quiet circle of listeners scattered across the world. Now, let's set the room, dim the lights. Let a fan hum like distant amphitheater air. Let your shoulders drop. The day can wait outside the door. As you settle in, know that there may be moments of gentle, respectful humor along the way. The kind that lets the mind breathe without breaking the fabric of what happened. Think of it as a warm blanket laid across cold facts. You hear your fridge hum. You hear a scooter pass. You shift in your own bed. Now strip those sounds away. You hear carts rattle on stone. You hear dogs bark in alleys. You hear oil lamps crack as they cool. You open your eyes, marble glows in firelight. You breathe incense, thick and heavy. You feel walls close with silence, and then you see him. The Emperor bends over a wife he killed, and you wait, about to be remade in her shadow. Chapter 1. The Struggle. Losing Poppæa. It begins with a quarrel in the palace. Not politics, not conspiracies, just husband and wife. Poppæa Sabina, pregnant, sharp-tongued, unwilling to soften her words. Nero, already restless, already bruised by the weight of power and the absence of limits. The argument flared. Perhaps she mocked his stage performances. Perhaps she scolded him for neglecting her. Ancient writers do not agree on the words, but they all agree on the silence that followed. Nero's rage struck her down. A kick. A blow enough to end both her life and the unborn child. The palace air turned heavy. Perfume still clung to the walls. Incense still smoldered. But everything had changed. Servants froze, pretending not to breathe. An emperor knelt in horror beside the woman he loved, realizing he had killed her with his own hands. This was the struggle. Grief, sharpened by guilt. Nero could not undo the moment. He refused the Roman custom of burning her body. Instead, he embalmed her like a relic, surrounding himself with her image, her scent, her silence. He made the court pretend she still lived, her chair left empty at feasts, her name spoken in the present tense. Here lay his dark ingenuity. If reality had betrayed him, he would invent another. Sculptors carved her face again and again. Perfume makers tried to distill her presence back into the air. Every effort was an attempt to reanimate what was gone, but the cost was madness. The palace became a stage where everyone performed for a ghost. To dine beside Nero was to smile at an empty chair, to pour wine into no one's cup. It was less a court than a mausoleum wearing makeup. And in this dim, desperate theater eyes straining to find her, Nero noticed someone else. A young freedman with delicate features that echoed hers. Just enough resemblance to make a broken man believe he had been offered another chance. And that leads us quietly into part 2, where Sporus himself steps into the Emperor's grief, not as a boy, but as the shadow of a dead wife. The quarrel was not about empire, but about small wounds, late nights, the hunger for applause. Poppæa's voice was sharp, unwilling to bend. Nero's temper rose like fire in a dry room. A strike, a kick. Then silence so sudden it felt like the air itself stopped. 2 lives ended in that moment, and the emperor who ruled millions realized he could not master himself. After the blow, the palace froze, and servants stood as still as statues. The palace froze. Servants stood as still as statues. Perfume lingered in the air, but underneath, the metallic tang of blood. Nero bent over her body. He whispered commands, bargains, pleas. Physicians were dragged in, hands trembling, but nothing they did could change what had already broken. His power reached everywhere except this. His grief turned into ritual when he refused fire and ash and demanded embalming. He refused fire and ash. He demanded embalming, her body preserved, as if she might still return. Sculptors carved her likeness again and again. Perfume burned in her rooms, until the very air carried her memory. It was not mourning. It was denial turned into ritual. A theatre of grief, where the stage never closed. Banquets became ghostly plays. With her chair left empty, yet wine still poured. Banquets became ghostly plays. Her chair stood empty, yet wine was poured. Toward nothing. They spoke her name in the present tense. Every gesture was an offering to absence. Every feast, a masquerade for a ghost. The palace was no longer a court. It was a mausoleum dressed in silk and jewels. And in that dim theatre, Nero searched faces until his gaze stopped on a boy whose features echoed hers too closely to ignore. The torches gutter low. Perfume thins, leaving only silence to keep the room. Breathe once, and let it rest there. Chapter 2. Sporus chosen. The palace had become a tomb in motion. Every corridor smelled of incense. Every banquet felt like a funeral performed in costume. In that hush, Nero's eyes wandered. He studied faces as if they were mirrors, seeking the one he had shattered. Among servants and freedmen stood a boy named Sporus. Delicate eyes, a softened jaw. Not the same as Poppæa, but close enough for grief to take hold. For the Emperor, it was not accident. It was an answer, a thread thrown back by fate. Sporus did not step forward. He was pulled, drawn by the gravity of a gaze that had already decided what he must become. Here the struggle shifts. A boy's quiet life pressed beneath an emperor's dream. Nero spoke to him gently, but the gentleness was iron wrapped in silk. Names began to change on the emperor's tongue. Sabina, beloved, wife. The ingenuity was cruel and simple. Call the echo by the name of the original until the echo believed it. And the cost was immediate. Sporus became less visible as himself. Each time the name Poppæa filled the room. From this moment, every step he took inside the palace was a step into someone else's shadow. The court understood and looked away, as courts often do when survival prefers silence. So the choice was made not by the boy, but around him. And the night moved on, carrying him toward a future already dressed in another woman's colors. The hall glowed with oil lamps, incense drifting like slow breath over marble. The hall was bright with oil lamps, incense drifted like slow breath over marble. Nero watched the boy from a distance, one look, then another, as if testing a memory against living flesh. Sporus kept his eyes lowered. He knew that to be seen was dangerous. He knew that to resemble the dead was worse. Nero's words softened, his orders now hidden inside endearments. A name was tried on like a veil. Sabina. Nero began to speak of yesterday, as if it could be remade tomorrow. For gestures, for posture, for presence not from Sporus, but from the woman he insisted stood before him. Sporus had been freed in law, but never in life. Freedom in the palace was a ribbon, bright and easily pulled. He could not refuse the emperor. He could not flee the city that fed him. His yes was silence. His no was unthinkable. Once, freedom papers had been placed in his hand, a promise that he was no longer a slave. But in the palace, freedom was only another word Rome liked to use as decoration. The parchment had meant nothing against the emperor's gaze. He had walked through the gates as a freedman. Yet inside, chains returned heavier than before, because they were invisible and written into his very breath. Lessons began without names, with commands to stand here and look there. Hold your hands like this. Rooms once used for service filled with garments not his, jewels not meant for him, mirrors that showed a stranger. He learned the outline first, then the walk, then the quiet smile that pleased the man who watched. And so chapter 2 fades in candlelight, a glance becoming a summons becoming a fate. The hush that follows grows heavier. What grief could not summon with names, it now seeks with sharper instruments of silence. If you're ready, let us drift into Chapter 3, The Transformation. The palace no longer whispered, it braced itself. A chamber was chosen, and into it the boy was led. He had no voice left for protest. Inside, every thought curled inward like a trapped animal. He told himself, perhaps, that it might only be a humiliation, a disguise, a passing cruelty, but when his eyes fell on the instruments laid out, he knew. He understood that his life was no longer his own. His mind recoiled. It tried to step out of his body, to perch above the slab like a bird fleeing a burning tree. From that height he saw himself not as boy, not as servant, but as an offering stretched for sacrifice, skin pale, limbs trembling, eyes wide with disbelief. It was as if another Sporus lay there, while the real one hovered just out of reach, watching, powerless, waiting for the knife to finish the ritual. The body tensed, heart hammering, breath quick and shallow. Even before the knives touched him, fear had already cut deeper. The struggle was survival of the self. The ingenuity was silence, holding his screams until breath burst. The cost was not only flesh but the slow breaking of identity. When it ended, when the knives were lowered, the boy felt as though he had been hollowed out, and worse, that hollow now belonged to someone else. Sporus's mind drifted while pain thundered through him. He tried to leave his body behind, to float above the slab, to imagine fields he had once played in as a child. But the cries pulled him back each time, reminding him he was still there, still being undone. A part of him begged for death. Another part clung fiercely to life. Neither side could win, so he remained suspended in torment, neither alive nor gone, but broken in between. When Nero called him Sabina, Sporus felt his name slip like sand from his hands. He wanted to shout, "I am Sporus," but his throat carried no strength, and what use was a truth when every ear in the room belonged to the Emperor? So he let silence answer for him. It was the only choice he had. Inside, a thought pressed against the pain. If I cannot be myself, perhaps I can learn to be no one. Perhaps invisibility will protect me. But invisibility was impossible under the Emperor's gaze. Alone in his fever, Sporus drifted between nightmares and waking. He saw Poppæa's face, though he had never known her. He heard Nero whisper her name, yet the voice bent toward him. At times he imagined he had died, that what walked now was a shell. At other times, he clung stubbornly to his own memories, the lessons of childhood, the warmth of sunlight before palace walls, the laughter of friends long gone. But those memories felt thin, like voices fading in the distance. Each day, Nero's dream pressed harder, while Sporus's own self dissolved. When dressed and perfumed, Sporus looked into the mirror. The reflection startled him. It was not a stranger, nor entirely himself, but a ghost sewn from pieces of both. A bitter thought came. They have killed me, but kept my body walking, so grief may have its dole. Each time Nero smiled at him, Sporus felt the weight of two deaths, Poppæa's and his own, and yet he bowed, and yet he obeyed. Because life, however altered, was still life. This was his prison, and endurance was his only weapon. The echo of knives fades. What lingers is not sound, but a hush too deep for words. Stay in that quiet a little longer. Chapter 4, The Wedding. Nero's illusion had survived knives and silence, but grief demanded more. He wanted Rome itself to bear witness, to bless his dream, to bow before the shadow he had created. So the palace became a theater. Servants stitched silk through the night. Jewelers reset stones that once belonged to Poppæa. Hair was curled until it smelled of smoke. Perfume clung heavy as chains. Sporus, still healing, was drawn into garments that pressed against wounds. Paint brushed across his face-hid pallor with rouge. Powder softened his jaw. A veil draped him in silence. Then came the night of the ceremony. Torches blazed. Incense swirled. Musicians filled the hall with melodies of union. Guests applauded on command, their eyes darting between fear and horror. Nero spoke vows to a boy dressed as the dead. Bread was broken, documents sealed, and the empire bowed to a marriage that was no marriage at all. The preparations. The palace was restless, bolts of fabric stacked high like barricades. Seamstresses worked until their backs ached, hands pricked raw from needles. Every jewel carried a memory. Once Poppæa's, now pressed against Sporus's skin, they glittered, but felt like stolen breath. The dressing of the bride Sporus stood before mirrors he did not wish to face. Servants circled him, tying, pinning, brushing powder, until his reflection blurred. The boy beneath the paint vanished. What stared back was a mask, crafted to please the emperor's grief. Every tug of fabric reopened pain. Every jewel fastened was a weight pulling him deeper. The ceremony torches lit the hall like fireflies trapped in stone. Music swelled, and Nero entered, radiant with obsession. He held Sporus's hand, called him Sabina, and veiled his face. The guests clapped in unison, their applause thin, their hearts colder than marble. The hall itself seemed to hesitate. A harp trembled in the corner, its strings quivering under uncertain hands. Silk whispered as garments brushed. The stone floor, a sound soft yet unyielding. Now and then, the clash of silver knives and goblets rang out too sharply, a cold metallic reminder beneath the enforced music. These sounds, fragile and misplaced, cut through the hush like tiny fractures in glass signs that even the air resisted the illusion. The guests, they knew what they saw. They knew it was grotesque, but survival demands performance. So they smiled, bowed, spoke blessings they did not mean. Behind every grin was dread. Behind every toast was silence. The new Empress. From that night forward, Sporus was no longer boy or servant. He was Sabina. He had chambers, servants, a retinue fit for an empress. But in mirrors, he saw only absence. Not Sporus, not Poppæa, but a hollow stitched from grief. Struggle, exist inside someone else's ghost. Ingenuity, obedience polished until it gleamed. Cost, the self buried deeper, under silk, under names, under silence. The veil settles, applause dies like embers. What remains is only the weight of night. Chapter 5. The Public Life. The wedding had ended, but its echo did not fade. Nero wanted more than vows. He wanted display. So Sporus was drawn into the emperor's orbit, not hidden in chambers, but set before the empire, an illusion paraded as truth. Banquets, festivals, processions at each. He appeared beside Nero, draped in silks, veiled in perfume, smiling when commanded, silent when silence was safer. Rome watched. Some gasped. Some laughed behind closed doors. Most only bowed, because in the empire of Nero, disbelief was treason. The struggle was endurance. The ingenuity was pageantry. The cost was a life lived not in private grief, but in public theatre with no curtain call. The banquets stretched heavy with roasted meats and wine that smelled of spice. Musicians played flutes. Dancers spun in painted masks. At the emperor's side sat Sporus, veiled, jeweled, addressed by courtiers as Empress. Every toast rose in his direction. Every eye, darting and unsure, pretended not to see what they all knew. The festivals blazed with torches and drew crowds eager for spectacle. Nero rode in splendor, and beside him, Sporus, lifted high on a litter, silks flowing like banners. Children pointed, women whispered, men stared with narrowed eyes, but none dared mock aloud. To laugh at Nero's bride was to laugh at Nero, and that was a sentence no one survived. Inside the marble halls, Sporus was given his own retinue of attendants. They bowed to him, but their eyes carried pity. Every command he gave felt foreign on his tongue. Every courtesy he received reminded him of the role he could not escape. In quiet moments, he touched his face and felt the mask had moved inside him. Every lesson, every correction, had carved deeper than knives. He was not acting anymore. He was becoming the role. And that realization chilled him more than the cold marble floors ever could. Rumors slipped through Rome like smoke. and whispers carried the story to the empire's edges. Others, comedy, but none spoke too loudly. For every whisperer knew, the emperor had ears everywhere. Better to play along, to praise the Empress, than to join the long list of exiles and corpses left in Nero's wake. Beyond the marble avenues, the fiction, spread by rumor. Soldiers stationed on distant frontiers heard the tale and laughed uneasily over their rations, their helmets tilted against the wind. Farmers in dusty villages paused at wells, muttering the story as if it were both comedy and curse. Some scoffed, shaking their heads at the emperor's madness. Others grew afraid, wondering what wrath might spill outward from such a court, where grief could reshape a boy into a ghost. Rome's illusions reached even the edges of its empire, and there too, silence became the safest answer. The whole city became an auditorium with no exit. Everyone knew the play was false, but the seats were too soft, and fear itself stood at the aisle as usher. So they clapped not in belief, but in hope of leaving the theatre untouched. At night, Sporus whispered his name softly, as if it might vanish if spoken too loudly. When the banquets ended, when the torches dimmed and the last applause dissolved into night, silence returned. In that silence, Sporus faced himself. He no longer trusted mirrors. The figure they showed wore silks and jewels, but the eyes staring back looked empty, as if waiting for someone else to step in. Inside, his thoughts moved in circles. He whispered his name soft, hesitant, as if it might vanish altogether if spoken too loudly. Sporus, a name small enough to hide in a whisper, a name too fragile to survive the weight of an empire. Every gaze he endured in daylight clung to him at night. He felt their eyes even in dreams, as if the city itself had pressed chains onto his skin. There was no corner of the palace where he could belong to himself. Even his breath seemed borrowed, timed to Nero's moods, to the rhythm of performances. And yet, beneath the weariness, a faint ember survived, a thought unspoken. They may dress me, they may rename me, they may turn me into a ghost of another, but somewhere inside, I still know I am not her. Closing. It was a fragile defiance, invisible to all but himself. But it kept him alive, when every hour begged him to surrender completely. Chapter 6. Life behind the veil. The banquets ended. The festivals dimmed, but the role did not sleep. Even in quiet hours, when halls were empty, the veil remained. Life inside the palace was not life at all. It was rehearsal without pause. Each morning began with lessons that chipped away more of Sporus. They corrected the way he walked, heels softened, steps measured, hips turned just so. They corrected the way he sat, hands folded neatly, gaze lowered, chin tilted like marble statues of women. They corrected the way he spoke, tones raised lighter, phrases shortened, sentences ended with softness not his own. Every lesson chipped another corner off Sporus. Every correction taught him less of himself and more of the shadow he was forced to wear. The servants brushed his hair and fastened ornaments, calling him only Lady or Sabina. Sometimes he caught pity in their eyes, but pity was dangerous. So they hid it quickly, as if even compassion might be punished. In his private chambers, perfume and statues of Poppæa pressed his solitude into silence. He was given chambers of his own. Silks draped the walls, perfume burned in corners. Statues of Poppæa stood silent in alcoves, their eyes of stone always watching. Here he ate, here he slept, here he breathed in air heavy with someone else's memory. Every night, the walls whispered, not his thoughts, but hers, or rather, what Nero insisted were hers. And so he felt himself fading, replaced even in solitude. Sometimes a glance slipped into the mirror, and the reflection showed only a stranger. There were mirrors in every room. He learned to avoid them, but sometimes a glance slipped, and he saw a stranger veiled in silk, cheeks powdered, eyes outlined in kohl. The boy he remembered was gone. The reflection belonged to someone else, someone dead, someone he had never been. He whispered his name in secret. But the mirror did not answer. Sometimes, when the lessons ended and the chamber grew still, Sporus pressed his eyes shut and tried to summon a face. his mother's eyes, his father's voice, the fields where he once ran barefoot. But the images came blurred, as if they had been rubbed thin by years of silk and smoke. The laughter of childhood, once clear as water, now sounded faint, like echoes in a long corridor. He realized with dread that even memory had been taken from him. It was not Nero's hands that erased them, but the constant weight of someone else's image pressed over his own. And so his past began to dissolve, until he wondered whether he had ever belonged to it at all. He thought of himself as a manuscript, scraped thin, overwritten with the name Sabina. There were moments he thought of himself as a manuscript scraped thin, the old words shaved off beneath a knife, new ink pressed over the faint scars of the page. The name Sporus had not vanished, it had only been written over, layered with darker strokes. Sabina. To most eyes, the first line was gone, but in the slant of a lamp, he could still trace the shallow grooves of his own name, whispering back through the disguise. Each time the veil descended, his breath tightened, as if caught inside a cage. Of all the ornaments, the veil was cruelest. It covered him, yet displayed him. It hid his face, yet announced his presence. Through its gauze, the world was blurred, yet the world still stared back, seeing only what it was told to see. Each time the veil descended, he felt his breath tighten. Each time it lifted, he felt less of himself beneath it, and so the veil became more than fabric. It became his cage, with a boy who no longer belonged to his body, his name, or his silence. He lived behind a veil, a curtain he could never draw aside. Courtiers whispered in locked rooms, while the empire became a stage of silence. The halls of the palace echoed with music and incense. But when the torches dimmed, when footsteps faded, the whispers began. Courtiers bowed deeply in daylight, their lips pressed with rehearsed blessings. Yet at night, behind closed doors, they whispered what they dared not speak aloud. They called it madness. They called it blasphemy. Some called it comedy, but only in rooms locked and shuttered. For everyone knew, walls in Rome had ears, and Nero's ears were sharpest of all. In the markets, the people pretended to cheer. They lifted their children high to see the Empress. But afterward, in shadowed alleys, they shook their heads. Was that truly a woman? No, only a boy in silk. Then why must we call him bride? The answers were not spoken. They were swallowed, like smoke, swallowed by night. Fear bound every tongue. A wrong word could mean exile. A mocking laugh could end in chains. So the empire became a stage of silence. A million eyes saw the illusion. A million hearts doubted it. But a million mouths smiled and clapped in perfect rhythm. For Sporus, those whispers never reached his ears. But he felt them, like drafts seeping through closed windows. He knew he was not believed. He knew he was only endured. And in some twisted way, that knowledge deepened the cage. For it was not only the emperor's will, it was the empire's fear that kept him trapped in the role. Whispers coil, then vanish into walls. The air folds in on itself, holding everything still. Let it hold you too. Chapter 7. The Tour of Greece. The illusion could not remain in Rome alone. Nero's hunger for applause was boundless. If the city bent to his grief, then the world must bend as well. So he prepared a journey, not a modest pilgrimage, but a procession of splendor, stretching across seas, toward the festivals of Greece. And, of course, at his side was Sporus, the boy who had once been a servant, now displayed as Empress before foreign eyes. Ships waited in harbors, and the fiction prepared to travel with them. Ships waited in the harbors, their sails dyed purple, their decks gleaming with bronze. Crowds gathered to watch the emperor embark. They cheered with careful voices, but beneath the cheers lingered unease, for they saw the veiled figure at his side. And they knew the fiction was traveling too. Greece welcomed them with torches, theaters, and judges too afraid to deny Nero. Nero stepped onto the stage, singing, reciting, claiming laurels before judges, too afraid to deny him. Beside him sat Sporus, veiled, silent, paraded like a relic in human form. Foreign dignitaries bowed, but their eyes betrayed wonder and doubt. Nero sang, raced, and crowned himself victor, always calling Sporus Sabina. Nero believed himself artist, poet, god in flesh. He sang with trembling passion, his voice breaking yet praised as divine. He raced chariots, always crowned victor, and each triumph he claimed, he shared with Sporus, calling him Sabina, holding his hand before the crowds, offering kisses as if to prove the dead lived again. The Greeks whispered in private, laughing uneasily at the grotesque spectacle. The Greeks were seasoned spectators. They had seen tragedies, comedies, myths of gods in disguise. Yet even they, masters of theatre, found this spectacle unsettling. They whispered in private houses, they laughed in shaded courtyards. But in the amphitheatres, they clapped as commanded. For Rome's emperor was not an actor to critique. He was a storm to endure. For Sporus, the journey blurred into heat, silks, and endless foreign stares. Some curious, some mocking, some pitying, but none of them freed him. Every city became another mirror, reflecting the same illusion. And in that endless parade, his silence deepened until it seemed he had vanished completely inside the role. So the tour of Greece passed, with Nero triumphant in his own eyes, and Sporus fading further into a living ghost. But illusions weigh even on those who invent them. As whispers grew, as Rome waited, the emperor himself began to fracture. And here, to balance the voices of the people, we paused to listen to him. At night, Nero doubted, feeling only absence and knowing death could not be conquered. Nero lay awake in chambers heavy with incense. Around him, courtiers whispered obedience, but in the still hours, he heard only absence. He spoke to Sporus as though to Poppæa. He convinced himself the voice that answered was hers. Yet doubt gnawed at him. When he touched Sporus's hand, he felt the fragility of youth, not the woman he had destroyed. When he gazed at the veil, he sometimes glimpsed the boy beneath, and fury rose. For reality had betrayed him again, so he demanded more pageantry. More costumes, more festivals, more applause. Every cheer was a bandage. Every laurel, another layer of denial. But beneath it all, a truth whispered, low and insistent, that no crown, no silk, no knife could resurrect what was gone. And in that whisper, Nero's mind shuddered, for he knew he was emperor of the world, but not of death. The sea hushes its applause. Only the creak of ships drifts in the dark. Rest there, where even triumphs fall asleep. Chapter 8. The Fall of Nero. Rome was no longer singing. The applause that once drowned doubts had faded into murmurs of anger. In taverns, in barracks, in whispered meetings of senators, the name Nero shifted from reverence to ridicule. The emperor who had made the world his stage was about to learn that even the grandest performance cannot silence. Hunger cannot erase betrayal, cannot charm eternity. Grain shortages and taxes turned applause into mutters of scorn. It began with shortages. Grain ships delayed, taxes pressed heavier. The people grew restless. Fires still haunted memory. Spectacle no longer soothed. Crowds who once cheered his songs now muttered in alleys, their voices sharp with hunger and scorn. The empire's heart was tired, and tired hearts do not clap for long. The streets that once glittered with petals now rustled with refuse. Hands that had tossed roses into his path now flung scraps and ash. On cracked walls, charcoal lines appeared grotesque drawings of the emperor, names twisted into curses, laughter carved into stone where once hymns had echoed. Rome itself seemed to spit out the man it once adored. Once, flowers had been scattered along his path, petals trembling under the hooves of horses, crowds stretching their hands to touch the dust he walked upon. Now, the same streets spat him out. Windows slammed shut as he passed, children hurled pebbles and rotten figs, walls bore scratches, words carved by hurried hands. Nero no more. Rome remembers the fire, where once garlands hung, now hung rags, mocking, tattered, like laughter pinned to stone. Far away, governors weighed their chances and armies marched beneath new banners. Far from Rome, men of ambition stirred, Galba in Spain, others in Gaul and Africa. They counted Nero's follies and weighed their chances. The scales tipped quickly. Armies once sworn to Caesar listened to new voices, marched beneath new banners. The empire began to split like dry wood. The Praetorian Guard wavered, and by nightfall Nero's corridors were empty. The Praetorian Guard, his shield, his instrument, felt the change. Gold no longer bought loyalty. Promises rang hollow. Fear itself began to wobble. One morning, Nero awoke Emperor of Rome. By nightfall, he was Emperor of empty corridors. The Palatine Hill grew silent, leaving the Emperor wandering among shadows. The Palatine Hill grew silent. Corridors that once swelled with courtiers now echoed only with footsteps fleeing. Doors slammed shut. Servants vanished. The Emperor wandered rooms once crowded with praise and found only shadows. Even his laughter, forced and desperate, sounded small. Condemned by the Senate, Nero fled through gardens heavy with dew. When word came that the Senate had condemned him, when even the guard abandoned his cause, Nero fled, not in triumph, but in secrecy, through gardens heavy with dew, through back gates meant for servants, toward a villa outside the city. At his side, still, was Sporus. Dragged into the darkness, he followed not as companion, not as lover, but as the ghost of a dead woman, the illusion Nero could not abandon. At a villa outside Rome, Nero wailed and clutched treasures in fear. The villa's walls closed in. By day, Nero paced like a caged beast. By night, he wept and wailed, his voice cracking against stone. One moment he boasted of legions returning. The next, he begged gods for mercy. He clutched treasures, kissed statues, sang fragments of songs to an audience of silence. And always, beside him, stood Sporus, silent, veiled, watching the unraveling of a man who had once been invincible. Sporus watched him from the corner of the lamplit room. This was not the figure who had commanded legions. Not the man who once demanded that Rome itself applaud his song. Stripped of torches and crowns, Nero's face seemed smaller, his hands trembling like any frightened man's. The sweat on his brow caught no light, for there was no light left to catch. To Sporus, it was almost unbearable to see the Emperor reduced to flesh and fear, to see the man who had filled the world with his shadow now cower in a darkness of his own making. And in that vision, Sporus understood. He had never been chained to a god. He had only ever been chained to a man. News of rebels closing in drove him to a dagger and a final gasp. News crept closer each hour. Rebels at the gates, enemies tightening their circle. The Emperor's hands shook as he gripped a dagger. He spoke of courage. He rehearsed words of defiance, but when the moment came, he faltered. He could not act alone. Those nearby urged him on, reminding him death was kinder than capture. Still, he hesitated, until one loyal hand guided his own. Steel pierced flesh, the room filled with a gasp, half horror, half relief. The Emperor of Rome collapsed, not on a battlefield, not in a Senate hall, but in a villa corner, his empire already gone. A boy veiled in silence, dragged into every shadow of this tragedy, stood as witness. He had lived years in another's name, bent under grief, not his own, and now he faced a moment where even grief had abandoned him. It is through those eyes that we must pause, to hear not the Emperor's voice, but the silence of Sporus, the last witness to the fall. The witness. The villa was heavy with incense and sweat. Shadows clung to the walls, as if even the torches were reluctant to bear witness. Nero lay crumpled, breath rattling, the dagger dark with what it had taken. Around him, men shifted uneasily, their loyalty already bending toward tomorrow's victors. But in the corner, veiled still, stood Sporus. For years he had lived as reflection, as mask, as voice, never his own. He had learned to lower his eyes, to move as though he belonged to silence. Now, silence was all that remained. He looked at the Emperor, at the man who had carved him into a monument of grief. He felt no triumph, no justice, only a hollowness, as though something inside him had been buried along with that final breath. In that moment, he understood the cruelty of his place. When Nero lived, he was prisoner to obsession. Now that Nero died, he was prisoner to memory. A shadow cannot walk free simply because the figure who cast it has vanished. He wanted to cry out his name, Sporus, to claim it back from the silence. But his lips did not move. The years of being Sabina weighed too heavily. Even alone, he dared not break the roll. What he felt most was not freedom, but drift, as if he were a boat cut from its moorings, floating into dark waters without oar, without sail, without shore. He was alive, but untethered, and in that untethering was terror more profound than death itself. So he stood still, veiled, silent, a witness not just to Nero's end, but to the quiet realization that his own story would not end here. For the world outside the villa was already moving. New hands would reach for him, new chains would claim him, and the boy who had once been Sporus understood, with the clarity of despair, that surviving Nero was not the same as escaping him. The night exhales. Nothing moves now but shadows. Let them pass quietly over you. Chapter 9. After Nero. The emperor was gone. The villa emptied of his cries. Rome turned its gaze elsewhere. But Sporus did not vanish with him. He remained, not freed, not restored, only shifted like property passed from one hand to another. The end of Nero's shadow did not mean the end of Sporus's prison. It only meant the chains would soon be clasped by someone new. Sporus was led away like property. His chains passed to new hands. They told him to gather his things, but he had none. Nothing in the chambers belonged to him. Not the silks, not the jewels, not even the name that had been pressed onto his tongue. He walked through corridors stripped of Nero's voice. Yet the silence felt heavier, because it was his own silence now. Sporus did not ask, "Where am I going?" He knew better. Questions were for people who still owned their futures. Instead, he followed, step by step, as attendants whispered arrangements as though he were a chest of treasures being inventoried, weighed, and delivered. Inwardly, he felt a strange doubling. On one side, relief. The man who had broken him was gone. He would not hear that voice again, commanding him to smile, to stand straighter, to breathe as though breathing could resurrect the dead. On the other side, dread. For what was he now, except a shadow without a master? An echo still trapped in the air long after the speaker had fallen silent. He thought of freedom, but the thought rang hollow. Freedom requires a self to return to, and what self remained? When he tried to recall his own voice, the sound came blurred, like a memory drowned underwater. When he whispered his name, Sporus, it felt smaller each time, as if the word itself were ashamed to exist. The courtiers treated him with care, but not kindness. They bowed slightly, handled him delicately, the way one carries a fragile relic. Not for his sake, for theirs. Because in him lived the ghost of an emperor's madness, a dangerous ghost, yet still useful, still glittering in the eyes of men hungry for power. And so he was led from one house to another, like a prized possession, but never a person. He realized then, death had freed Nero from obsession, but not him from being its monument. The chains had shifted, but chains they remained. He sometimes saw himself walking the corridors as if it were another boy entirely. Steps measured, hands resting just so, every movement rehearsed, closing. Meanwhile, the eye he still carried stood a little apart, pressed against the wall's edge, flinching each time the name Sabina rang out. Once, in a corridor hushed with dust, Sporus overheard two servants whisper, "He is unlucky, that boy," one said. "Even the gods would not envy him." Their words slid back into silence, but they clung to him more tightly than the veil ever had. Chapter 10. Otho's court power had shifted again. Rome did not pause. The ashes of Nero's reign were still warm, and yet a new figure stepped forward. Otho. For Sporus, it was not a beginning. It was another transfer, another set of hands to carry his chains. Otho rose to power, his throne fragile as ice beneath him. Otho had once been Nero's companion, a man who had watched the palace's strange theatre from within. Now he wore the purple himself. The court moved quickly to flatter him. Senators bent their words. Guards adjusted their allegiance. The city rehearsed new chants, but beneath the surface, the air was brittle. Everyone knew power in Rome was fragile, that this emperor's seat was no throne of stone, but a chair set upon cracking ice. Into this tremor of a court, Sporus was brought. Otho kept Sporus not as treasure but as a relic of Nero's reign. Otho did not love him, not as Nero had, with obsession sharpened by grief, but he was curious. Here was the boy whispered about in every corridor, the one dressed as Empress, the one who had survived Nero's madness. To possess Sporus was to inherit a fragment of Nero's aura. It made Otho seem closer to the drama just past, as if the stage of empire had not been cleared but only recast. So Sporus was kept, not as treasure, not as spouse, but as curiosity, a relic displayed in the uncertain dawn of a new rule. Otho's gaze moved over him the way a collector studies a relic valued for its strangeness, not its soul. To him, Sporus was not a companion, but a token of Nero's play, an artifact carried forward to decorate the present reign. Courtiers studied him carefully, whispering whether the play would be repeated. Courtiers studied him carefully, some with pity, some with mockery, many with fear. They whispered, "Will this emperor demand the same play as the last? Will Sporus be crowned again, or is he simply a reminder of madness best forgotten?" Every feast became another theatre. Sporus sat veiled, hands folded, while eyes darted toward him like moths circling flame. The courtiers drank their wine, but their glances never strayed too far, for Sporus was both scandal and symbol, too dangerous to laugh at, too strange to ignore. For Sporus, the palace was a painting moved to another wall. Unchanged, he felt like a painting lifted from one wall to another. Different room, different owner, same frame, same portrait. At night he lay awake, listening to the distant murmur of guards, the rustle of courtiers. He wondered if his existence was nothing more than an echo, carried forward by those too afraid to let it fade. Relief did not come, only repetition, and in repetition, the erosion of hope. Otho's reign cracked quickly, leaving Sporus waiting for another fall. Otho's reign lasted only weeks. Outside the palace walls, armies clashed. Vitellius marched with legions hardened by hunger. The empire trembled, choosing sides as if in a game of dice. Sporus sensed it, the unease that dripped from every servant's whisper, the hurried glances of ministers, the silence that fell whenever news arrived. He knew what it meant. When thrones collapse, those sitting closest to them are often crushed beneath the fall. So Otho's palace was never home. It was a waiting room, a fragile shelter in the storm. And for Sporus, it was proof that the past was not past at all, it had only changed costumes. Soon, Otho, too, would be gone, and the boy veiled in silence would once more be handed forward, toward a fate darker still. Silence pressed harder, and Sporus wondered if he was only a prize of crowns. The palace had grown quiet again, not with peace, but with the hush that comes before collapse. Messengers rode in at night, dust still on their cloaks. Their words were short, their faces grim. Another army marched, another name was rising. Sporus listened from behind veils. He did not need the details. He had learned the rhythm by now. One emperor falls, another ascends, and in the shuffle, he is carried along, like a coin passed from hand to hand. But the silence pressed hardest. It filled his chambers, it weighed on his breath. Every pause in the corridors sounded like footsteps of departure. Every hurried glance of a servant felt like prophecy. He wondered, when the throne shifts again, will I shift too? Am I condemned to live forever in someone else's performance? At night, he lay awake, hearing the faint scrape of armor beyond the walls, the restless shifting of guards uncertain of their loyalties. Sleep would not come. Only the question returned, again and again, until it hollowed him out. Am I Sporus still, or only the prize of whichever man wears the crown? Chapter 11. Vitellius and the Games. Otho's reign ended as quickly as it began. The empire shifted again, its throne claimed by Vitellius, and as crowns changed heads, Sporus was carried forward once more, not as citizen, not as servant, but as ornament, as curiosity, as symbol of Rome's most recent madness. In Vitellius's court, the whispers grew darker. Vitellius entered with trumpets, and Sporus was presented still veiled and jeweled. The palace gates opened wide. Trumpets blared for the new emperor. Crowds pressed forward, chanting names they had once cursed. Inside, Sporus was presented, veiled, silent, still adorned with jewels that once belonged to a dead empress. Vitellius regarded him with amusement, not devotion, not desire. Amusement, like a man turning over a strange coin, wondering how it might be spent. Vitellius saw in him not devotion but an opportunity for spectacle. Vitellius was no poet, no dreamer. He had none of Nero's obsessions, but he understood spectacle. Rome was a city that fed on shows, bread and games, blood and theatre. And Vitellius, heavy with indulgence, saw in Sporus an opportunity for both. To him, the boy was not a ghost of Poppæa. He was a living prop, an actor waiting for a stage he could not refuse. Courtiers whispered of a cruel play where Sporus would act as Proserpina. The courtiers spoke of it in hushed tones. A new spectacle was being devised, a reenactment of myth. Proserpina, the maiden dragged into the underworld, struggling against Pluto's grip. Vitellius planned to cast Sporus as the maiden, to dress him in flowing robes, to parade him before thousands, to turn his life into cruel comedy. The whispers spread like smoke, and wherever Sporus walked, eyes followed him with pity, or with morbid anticipation. At night, the plan seeped into his dreams. He saw himself dragged downward, robes tearing, torches flaring against damp stone, voices howled like shades of the underworld, and chains scraped over rock as if Hades himself had summoned him. He woke with his heart hammering, the image still clinging like ash to skin. The plan hollowed him, and he realized death would be kinder than the arena. For Sporus, the news struck like cold iron. He had been carved, veiled, married, paraded. But this was worse. This was not illusion in private halls. This was humiliation before an empire. He imagined the roar of the crowd, the dust of the arena, the hands that would shove him forward, costumed as a goddess, while thousands laughed and jeered. The thought hollowed him. He realized that in such a moment, death would be kinder than breath. The Colosseum haunted his dreams, its sand already clinging to his skin. The Colosseum loomed in his dreams. He had never entered it, yet he felt its stones pressing against his chest at night. He could hear the clamor of the crowd, the rattling of cages, the metallic scent of blood. He imagined himself in the sand, garments torn, body displayed. And all the while, Rome would cheer. They would not see Sporus. They would not even see Sabina. They would see only a play, a myth performed in flesh, a spectacle to be forgotten once the sand was raked clean. He understood that unless he ended the play himself, the stage would devour him. Vitellius delayed, as emperors often did, lost in feasts and indulgence. But the plan lingered. It grew sharper with each retelling. And Sporus understood. The stage was being built. The role was being written, and he would be forced to perform, unless he ended the play himself. They wanted him to play the maiden dragged below. In dreams, the chains never missed their mark. Every torch found his face. Every voice in the crowd demanded his fall. And yet, waking, he realized, if he must descend, let it be on his own feet so that the door of the underworld, at least this time, would open because he knocked. So chapter 11 closes with silence, heavy as stone. The crowd has not yet gathered, but their voices already echo in his mind. The arena has not yet opened, but its sand already clings to his skin. And Sporus, the boy carved into ghost, knows that the cruelest stage of all waits just beyond the next dawn. Alone with his veil laid aside, he weighed the cup prepared for him. The palace slept. Feasts had ended. Torches burned low. and the corridors lay empty. But Sporus did not sleep. He sat alone, the veil laid aside, his hair unpinned, the ornaments scattered like broken promises across a table. For the first time in years, his reflection in polished bronze was only a boy's face, worn, pale, but his. And yet, even this sight felt borrowed. The name beneath it felt faint, a whisper that struggled to rise. He thought of the arena, the sand, the crowd that would cheer his humiliation. He felt their eyes already, clawing at him, tearing away the last fragments of self he still carried. He knew that if he entered that place, there would be nothing left afterward. Not Sporus, not even Sabina. Only silence, but silence mocked by laughter. The night pressed closer. He heard the faint snore of guards beyond the walls, the creak of beams in the dark. Every sound reminded him he was still alive. And yet life felt thinner than the flame shivering in a single lamp nearby. He weighed his breath. He touched the cup set by his side. He knew what it contained. The choice had been prepared quietly, like an escape tunnel dug beneath the noise of empire. In that cup was the only freedom left to him, the power to decide how the play would end. So he sat, hands folded, eyes steady, and for the first time in years felt a fragment of control return. The boy who had been veiled, remade, mocked, and paraded was about to choose silence on his own terms, and that thought, fragile yet fierce, carried him into the final hour. The torches burn low, dreams cling like smoke, then thin into nothing. Leave them drifting. As you close your eyes. Chapter 12. The Last Choice. The night had been long. Now the first pale threads of dawn slipped across the floor like quiet stitches. The guards still dozed. The corridors lay hushed, the palace breathing in its sleep. Inside Sporus, a decision had taken root. He would not be led into the arena, fed to the ritual laughter of strangers. If his life had been a play forced upon him, then the final act at last would be his own. Dawn spread slowly, and Sporus let its plain honesty be his last sight. The lamp had kept vigil, its wick a curled ember, glowing the dull red of a coal that refuses to die. The room brightened slowly, not in a rush, but in shy increments. A line of white along the shutter, a softening of the ceiling's shadow, the first dust motes lifting like tiny, startled birds. Sporus watched the light unfasten the night. Every ordinary thing grew precise, the grain in the table, the chip on the pitcher's lip, the small burn mark left by an incense ash long ago. The cold of the stone crept up through his bare feet. And for once, he did not pull away. He wanted to feel the morning entirely, its clean air, its faint hearth smell, the way the silence held space for the world to reappear. He remembered other mornings that were not mornings, lamps blazing at noon, rooms thick with perfume, the sun bullied from the palace by velvet drapes. This dawn felt honest, spare, unornamented. A thought came without drama. Let my last sight be simple. Not a stadium's roar, not a sea of tilted faces, just this narrow beam of day drawing a slow white path to where his hands rested. The clay cup offered not performance but a door. The cup waited on the table, coarse clay, the color of dry riverbeds. It owned no ornament, no story, no lie. Sporus turned it once, then again, listening to the soft rasp as it met the wood. He could smell what was inside, a bitter earthiness, like roots split open, sap and stone. How many cups had passed his lips? Spiced wine at banquets, honeyed waters, perfumes disguised as drinks. All of them, gestures chosen by others, timed to someone else's happiness. This one was different. It did not perform. It did not promise. It simply offered a door. His hands trembled not with fear, but with the strange recognition that choice had weight. To pick up the cup was to lift himself for the first time in years. He traced the rim with one finger, feeling the slight roughness where the potter's hand had slipped. A human flaw, a human kindness. Yes, he thought, let it be this ordinary clay, an ordinary, merciful end. He remembered darker nights before, when the thought of ending himself had pressed close. But guards watched, doors were locked, and fear gripped harder than hope. He had lived those hours as a captive of his own hesitation. Now, for the first time, he felt the balance tilt toward courage, toward decision, toward an end. That was his. Once, it was the unknown he feared. But now the most terrifying thing was what had become too familiar. The stage, the crowds, the borrowed name. So the unknown softened into something merciful. It asked for no role. It asked only for him. Before he drank, memories of Nero, Otho, and Vitellius passed like fading candles. Before the cup rose, the memories did. Nero first, his shadow and face, his hands that shook when they were not applauding themselves. The smell of myrrh around Poppæa's empty chair, the corridor that always led back to the same room, where Sporus learned to move as someone else, to speak in a voice borrowed from grief. Then Otho, the thin rein, the curious eyes, the way a court can cradle and display you in the same instant. Sporus felt again that strange museum. Hush, looked at, but never seen. Vitellius followed, heavy with appetite. His plans for the game spoken like jokes that delighted him. Sporus heard the rehearsals forming in other men's mouths, Proserpina's robe, the set of the stage, the laughter already taste-tested in private. And beneath these rulers, one image threaded every recollection. Himself. Receding. A name held behind the teeth. A face obscured by powders and veils, until even mirrors grew uncertain. He let each memory pass through him, like candles borne through a corridor seen, felt, and then released to darkness. By the time the last flame dwindled, his hands were steady. He lifted the cup. The clay was cooler than his skin. The first taste bit his tongue bitter, mineral, a sternness that refused disguise. He swallowed, and the bitterness unfurled through him, not cruel, only inevitable. Like a tide claiming what the tide has always claimed. He drank again, measuring each mouthful, as if counting backward from an old hurt. Halfway through, he paused, listening to the room. The shutter's faint tremor, the distant cough of a waking vendor, leather creak from a guard turning in his sleep. The world would continue without him. How gentle that felt to lay a burden down and know others would carry the morning forward. He finished the cup, set it down carefully, palming the table as if to say, I was here. I leave nothing tipped over. The chill crept upward, his breath rowing quietly across a dark lake. The change began at the edges. His toes cooled, then his calves, as if the stone floor were climbing him with patient frost. A shallow wave rose in his stomach, then ebbed. He lay back, cheek against rough linen, the cloth smelling faintly of smoke. And Sunday, the ceiling swam a little. He breathed with it in. When it approached, out. When it receded, a quiet rowing across a small, dark lake. When the tremor came, it surprised him less than remembered pain. The knives of years ago had been chaos. This was grammar, the body, speaking a last, firm sentence. He placed one hand upon his chest, felt the dwindling drum. Not a battle, a measurement, a gentle tallying of beats until the count is complete. Life rehearsed its lines outside, while he loosened thread by thread into quiet. The light had climbed the wall by then, a narrow ladder of day reaching the beam above. Outside, the market loosened its voice, wooden crates set down with hollow thuds. A mule's brief complaint. Someone laughing too loudly at nothing. Life rehearsed its lines without him, and the play was better for it. He did not close his eyes at once. He practiced a few more breaths, as if showing the air how to be soft around the space he would leave. No veil descended. No name was spoken. Sporus did not evaporate, he unknotted. Thread by thread, the tight weave of fear and obedience loosened, until cloth became mere strands, and strands became quiet. He wondered if anyone would find him by morning, and if they did, would they see the boy who once bore the name Sporus, or only the Empress they had invented and forced upon his skin. At the end, his mind set a final scene, not a palace, not a temple, but a field beyond both, grass bending under a plain wind, sky like calm water overturned above him. He walked, barefoot, the earth accepting every step without question. Far behind, a road unrolled, marble, sand, torch flame, applause, and lifted from the ground like a shed skin. Ahead, only color and air. He tried his name once more, Sporus, and heard it settle into the field like seed. Then the world, patient and immense, continued, and he was elsewhere, wherever mercy keeps its quiet rooms. So ends the story of Sporus, not beneath a stadium's cheer, but in the modest dignity of choosing how the curtain falls. A life forced to serve as mirror, finally allowed to be a window open to morning. The after-image Rome did not mourn him. Rome rarely mourned anyone. The markets opened. The Senate argued. The games thundered. Life rolled forward with its usual appetite, leaving no pause for a boy who had died quietly in some shadowed chamber. Yet the whispers lingered. In taverns, they spoke of the Emperor's plaything who had slipped away before the show began. Some laughed, mocking Vitellius for losing his spectacle. Others shivered uneasy that a figure shaped by so many emperors had chosen to vanish on his own terms. In private gardens, poets recited half-lines, of a youth dressed as Empress, of a love that became a wound, of a ghost called back too many times. The verses rarely named him. They did not need to. Everyone knew the story, even when they pretended not to. Historians wrote his name in passing, a footnote to Nero's madness, a curiosity in the margins of power. They recorded him as symbol, not as soul. To them, he was proof of Rome's decadence, a caution against emperors who let grief rot into theatre. But what of the boy himself? The boy who endured the silks and the powders, the empty chair and the jeering gaze. That boy dissolved between their lines, leaving only outline, only after-image, and time itself scribbled graffiti across him in tavern jokes, in half-finished poems, in the margin notes of historians. Those scrawls did not erase the person, they only painted a hollow smile over a face that had once known fear, once known pain. And still, in the silent hours of the city, one might imagine his presence, a pale shape at the edge of a torch's circle, a soft footstep where the marble cracks, a voice not raised, but felt, like the breath that follows words never spoken. Sporus remained, not in monuments, but in absence, a reminder that behind every spectacle stands a person who did not choose to play. So, this is where we leave Sporus, not in the center of Rome's applause, not in the glare of an emperor's torch, but in the quiet afterlight of memory. History writes in stone, but lives are lived in whispers, in the tremor of a harp string, in the hush of a name spoken once and lost. If tonight's slow drift through Rome carried you gently, let the story fade now into the dark of your room. If this quiet kept you calm, you can subscribe to my channel for more slow histories. A soft hello with your location and time would be lovely. The day has no claim here, only stillness does. For now, close your eyes. Rest. You've walked through enough history for one night. Good night. And from the shadows of the past to the stillness of your room, we'll meet again.